Have you ever pondered upon the intricate series of events that led to the Second World War, one of the most devastating conflicts in human history? In the aftermath of the Great War, the world was in a state of flux. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, was designed to establish a lasting peace. Yet it unwittingly sowed the seeds of another catastrophic conflict. The treaty, particularly punitive towards Germany, left the nation crippled economically and militarily. It was branded a diktat, an imposed settlement. Germany was held responsible for the war and was required to pay hefty reparations. These stipulations stirred a feeling of deep resentment within the German populace. As the Roaring Twenties gave way to the 30s, the world was stricken by an economic depression of unprecedented scale. The Wall Street crash of 1929 had a ripple effect across the globe, but it hit Germany especially hard. Already struggling under the weight of war reparations, the country was plunged into economic despair. Unemployment skyrocketed, and inflation ran rampant, leaving many Germans desperate and destitute. This sense of desperation created fertile ground for radical ideologies. The German people, burdened by the humiliation of Versailles and the economic hardship of the Depression, were ripe for a message of change, of restoration. They were ready to embrace anyone who promised to restore their nation's dignity and economic stability, even if it meant resorting to extreme measures. The world watched on, naively believing that the worst was over. Little did they know that within the despair and resentment brewing in post-war Germany, a new threat was rising. A threat that would plunge the world into a conflict far more devastating and widespread than the war that had preceded it. The seeds of war are often sown in times of peace, and so they were following the Great War. The stage was set for a storm of unimaginable proportions, and the world was blissfully unaware of the tempest that was about to unfold. In the midst of chaos, a dictator often finds his stage. Enter Adolf Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy. Two charismatic leaders who, in the wake of the First World War, seized the opportunity to rise to power. Their nations, ravaged by war and disillusioned by the perceived failings of democracy, were fertile ground for their authoritarian ideologies. In Germany, the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles had left the nation humiliated and economically crushed. Hitler, with his National Socialist German Workers' Party, promised a return to German pride. He painted a vision of a future where Germany would be the leading power in Europe, free from the constraints of the treaty. His rhetoric was potent, filled with nationalism and anti-Semitism, and it resonated with a populace desperate for change. On the other hand, Italy, despite being on the winning side of the First World War, was riddled with economic instability and social unrest. Mussolini capitalized on this discontent, promising stability and prosperity under his National Fascist Party. His ideology was centered around the revival of the Roman Empire, a promise that appealed to the nationalist sentiments of the Italians. Mussolini's rule was marked by a ruthless suppression of dissent, a characteristic that would come to define his regime. Both Hitler and Mussolini exploited the economic hardships and social unrest of their time to propagate their ideologies. Their promises of restoring national pride and delivering economic stability were attractive propositions to their war-torn, disillusioned citizens. They positioned themselves as the solution, the strong leaders who would guide their nations out of chaos and into a glorious future. Yet behind the charismatic speeches and promises of a better future, lay a darker truth. These were not benevolent leaders seeking to uplift their nations, rather they were dictators, ready to wield absolute power and control, even at the cost of human rights and freedoms. As these leaders gained power, the world watched in trepidation, unaware of the storm that was brewing. The world stage was set, and the actors were ready for their roles. As the 1930s unfolded, the world watched with bated breath as certain nations began to flex their military muscles, testing the limits of international tolerance. Japan, under the rule of Emperor Hirohito, was the first to strike. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a Chinese territory rich in natural resources. This was in direct violation of the League of Nations principles, yet the international community's response was ineffectual at best. Japan's successful invasion of Manchuria emboldened other nations with expansionist ambitions. Enter Germany. With Adolf Hitler at the helm, Germany was nursing the wounds of the Treaty of Versailles and seeking to reclaim its lost prestige. In 1938, Hitler made his move. First, he annexed Austria in what was known as the Anschluss. Then, he set his sights on Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia populated by ethnic Germans. Despite a clear breach of the treaty, the international community chose appeasement over confrontation, allowing Germany to take Sudetenland. And then, in a move that shocked the world and defied all political logic, Germany and the USSR, two ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact in August 1939. This pact, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, ensured that Germany could invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. It was a pact that reflected the cold, calculating realpolitik that would come to define the Second World War. Yet despite these clear transgressions, these blatant testaments to a world on the brink of war, the international community failed to take decisive action. The League of Nations, established to prevent such a crisis, proved impotent in the face of these challenges. Nations stood by, either paralyzed by fear, blinded by naivety, or shackled by their own political constraints. These events were clear warnings, yet they were ignored or inadequately addressed, setting the stage for a global conflict. Like a sudden clap of thunder, war arrived. In the early hours of September 1, 1939, the calm of the Polish countryside was shattered by the roar of German tanks and the whine of Stuka dive bombers. Germany, under the command of Adolf Hitler, had launched a full-scale invasion of Poland. The Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, as it was called, was a new form of warfare, combining rapid movement of tanks, infantry, and aircraft. The Polish forces were taken by surprise, and despite their valiant defense, were unable to hold back the German onslaught. Hitler had gambled that the Western powers of Britain and France would not intervene. He was wrong. 2 days later, on September 3rd, both Britain and France declared war on Germany, honoring their promise to protect Polish independence. The die was cast. The world was spiraling into another global conflict, just 21 years after the end of the First World War. In the halls of power in London and Paris, there was a grim determination to stand against Hitler's aggression. But there was also a deep sense of trepidation. The memories of the Great War, with its millions of dead and wounded, its shattered cities and broken lives, were still fresh. Yet they knew that the cost of appeasement would be even higher. In Germany, there was a mix of fear and excitement. Many Germans, still bearing the scars of the Treaty of Versailles and the humiliation it had imposed, saw the war as a chance to reclaim their lost honor and territory. But others, particularly those who remembered the horrors of the last war, viewed the coming conflict with dread. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with growing concern. President Roosevelt, while publicly maintaining a policy of neutrality, was privately worried about the rise of fascism in Europe and the threat it posed to world peace. Like a sudden clap of thunder, war arrived. And it was not just a European war, it was a world war. A war that would draw in nations from every corner of the globe, wreaking devastation on an unimaginable scale. The world was once again plunged into war, a war that would eclipse all previous conflicts in its scale and horror. The world was now a chessboard, with nations as pawns in a deadly game. The conflict that had begun in Europe was spreading like wildfire, engulfing nations far and wide. From the frozen landscapes of Russia to the scorching sands of North Africa, the war was truly global. The Pacific Theater, previously a spectator, was thrust into the limelight following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. On that fateful day in December 1941, the United States, a nation that had been trying to stay out of the conflict, was dragged in, kicking and screaming. The sleeping giant had been awakened, and its entry into the war would prove to be a game-changer. Across the Atlantic, in Europe, a different kind of horror was unfolding. A horror not of bombs and bullets but of systematic industrial-scale genocide. The Holocaust, as it would come to be known, saw the extermination of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany. It was an act of unspeakable evil that would leave a permanent scar on humanity's conscience. But in this time of darkness, there were also stories of resistance and resilience. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of unimaginable adversity. From the French resistance fighters sabotaging Nazi operations, to the brave souls who risked their lives to hide Jews from the Gestapo, their stories serve as a testament to the indomitable human spirit. The world was at war, not just a conflict between armies but a clash of ideologies and values. It was a battle for the very soul of humanity. Would the forces of freedom and democracy triumph over the dark tide of fascism and tyranny? As the war raged on, new alliances were forged, old ones were tested, and the map of the world was being redrawn. Every nation, every individual had to pick a side. There was no room for neutrality in this global game of chess. In the midst of this global conflict, humanity witnessed some of its darkest days. Yet, even in the face of such darkness, the human spirit refused to be extinguished. The world was at war, but hope was not lost. In every conflict, there comes a turning point. World War II was no different. The year was 1943, and the war had been raging for 4 long years, with no clear end in sight. But then came the Battle of Stalingrad. This was a brutal, months-long confrontation between the Axis powers and the Soviet Union, in the icy depths of a Russian winter. For the first time, the unstoppable German advance was halted and then reversed. The Soviet Union's victory at Stalingrad marked a significant shift in the course of the war. But the turning tide would not stop there. The following year in 1944, the Allies launched the Normandy invasion, also known as D-Day. Thousands of troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history. This marked the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime, as the Allied forces began their march towards Berlin. However, the war was not over yet. On the other side of the world, the United States was preparing to use a weapon of unprecedented power. In August of 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. These bombings resulted in Japan's unconditional surrender, effectively ending the war in the Pacific. Each of these events, the Battle of Stalingrad, the Normandy invasion, and the dropping of the atomic bombs, played a crucial role in turning the tide of World War II. They marked a shift in momentum, a change in the direction of the war. But it's important to remember that this turning point came at an immense cost. Millions of lives were lost, cities were reduced to rubble, and entire populations were forever scarred. These events marked the beginning of the end of the war, but at a horrific cost. When the dust settled, the world was forever changed. Such was the magnitude of World War II, a conflict so vast that it altered the course of human history. As the echoes of the last gunfire faded, the world collectively exhaled, relieved yet deeply scarred. The end of the war marked not just the cessation of hostilities but also the dawn of a new world order. In the aftermath, the victorious Allies sought to prevent a recurrence of such a catastrophic war. The result was the formation of the United Nations in October 1945. This international body was created with the mission to maintain peace and security worldwide, promote social progress, better living standards, and human rights. Born out of the ashes of the most devastating conflict in human history, the United Nations was the world's commitment to saying, never again. But the end of the war also brought with it new tensions. The geopolitical landscape was drastically altered as Germany, the instigator of the conflict, was divided. The victorious Allies split Germany into 4 zones of occupation. The United States, the United Kingdom, and France controlled the western zones, while the Soviet Union controlled the eastern zone. This division of Germany was a physical manifestation of the ideological divide that was growing between the East and the West, setting the stage for a new kind of conflict: the Cold War. As the world began to rebuild, this new tension between the democratic West and the communist East marked the beginning of the Cold War, a period of political and military tension that lasted for over 4 decades. It was a war of ideology, a war of attrition, fought not on the battlefields but in the hearts and minds of people across the globe. World War II reshaped our world, leaving scars that remain visible even today. The conflict ended, but its effects rippled through time, influencing the world we live in today. The aftermath of World War II was not just about rebuilding what was lost, but also about grappling with the new realities of a world forever changed. So, why did World War II happen? It's a question that has countless answers, each one as complex as the last. It's a story of economic despair, where the Great Depression left nations vulnerable, ripe for the rise of dictators who promised stability and prosperity. It's a tale of political maneuverings with the Treaty of Versailles and the ineffectual League of Nations which failed to prevent the march towards war. Ideologically, it's about the clash between fascism and democracy, a conflict of values that would shape the world for decades. It's about human ambition, fear, and the desire for power, elements as old as humanity itself. But most of all, it's a stark reminder of the cost of war. Millions of lives were lost, countries were ravaged, and the world was left forever changed. As we reflect on these events, let us remember the cost of war and strive for a world where such horrors are a thing of the past.